Anxiety. We hear it constantly. I've been collecting articles, op-eds, and reflections in preparation for this sermon series, but instead of giving you data on the rise in anxiety in our nation and culture, instead, here are 3 stories that both produce anxiety and are examples of what happens when we are ruled by our anxiety. Last week in Kansas City, Ralph Yarl was asked to go pick up his siblings from a house. He was supposed to go to Northeast 115th Terrace, but being 16, he was confused and he went to Northeast 115th Street to the home of Andrew Lester. He rang the doorbell. When Mr. Lester came to the door, he didn't ask, "May I help you?" He didn't say something more aggressive, such as, "What are you doing here?" He didn't just refuse to answer the door. Instead, he opened the door, he pulled out a gun, he shot through his storm door, and hit Ralph in the temple with one bullet and in the leg with another. Or last Saturday night, Kaylin Gillis and a group of her friends were in rural New York going to a friend's house. And they were in the backwoods of New York. They turned up what they thought was the driveway, but they were wrong. They pulled up the driveway of Kevin Monahan, who, when he saw the 3 cars approaching his house in the dark at 10 o'clock at night, he didn't shout out, "Get out of here!" He didn't call the police. He took a gun and he began firing upon the cars, hitting Kaylin and killing her, age 20. Y'all remember last Sunday afternoon? It was a beautiful spring day like today. Our 4-year-old Ruth, she wanted to go on a bike ride. She's got a purple bike, training wheels. It's got a basket on the front. When she gets ahead of me on the sidewalk, sometimes I have to run to catch up with her before she hits an uneven spot in the pavement to make sure she doesn't topple. Ordinarily, she chastises me, saying, "I can do it myself, Dad." We went down Arlington Road. We took a left on Sherwood. We had to cross the intersection at Greenwood because there was a big puddle in the middle of the road. We then took a right on Grandin. As we made our way down Grandin Road, Ruth stopped in front of Raleigh Court United Methodist Church. She stashed her bike behind the Methodist Church sign. The road starts to get a little steeper downhill as you approach Grandin Village, and her speed gets a little beyond her control. She's not that reliable with her foot brakes yet. So we walked hand in hand from there, looking for cars at each intersection, until we arrived at our final destination. And at 4 o'clock, we walked inside the 7-Eleven for Slurpees. Ruth got red and purple and white. We walked around the corner to the cash register. We paid for our Slurpees. We went home. 4.5 hours later, at that exact same location, on that same tile, at that same counter, a confrontation broke out between the store clerk and a customer. And the clerk pulled out a gun and shot and killed the customer in the 7-Eleven. That is 0.4 miles from where you are sitting right now. Creates anxiety, doesn't it? That going to street instead of terrace would get you shot. That turning up the wrong driveway could get you killed. That going out for a half gallon of milk on a Sunday night so that the kids can have cereal for breakfast before school the next day could put you at the scene of a murder. But don't these stories also tell us something about the anxiety that is dwelling in us collectively as a society? People living on edge, skeptical, fearful, so that misunderstanding and miscue immediately result in violence belligerence and rudeness, ending in death. How do we get here? How do we see our neighbors and our community differently? Is it even possible to be a people who are free from anxiety in a world that gives us lots of good reasons to be anxious? Anxiety is natural. The American Psychiatric Association states that anxiety benefits us in some ways because it focuses our attention on a test or a work project. It's that butterflies in the stomach before you take the mound in the baseball game, or you step out for the dance recital. It's that nervous energy before you stand up to give the toast, or before you walk into the job interview. It's normal. It's helpful energy. Anxiety, however, can become a problem to living. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual describes it as excessive worry and apprehensive expectations that occur within a person regularly on more days than not over a 6-month period, and that those feelings occur in a variety of situations and around a host of different activities. It can lead to feelings of being keyed up or on edge. It can also lead to feelings of being tired all the time, not being able to focus, being irritable, or struggling to sleep. This is the anxiety of the what ifs. Horror stories like those of our past week feed our imaginations with the dangerous situations that we encounter in our world. It drives us to see the potential danger and disaster and to figure out what we can do to avoid it. But then our imagination spirals because we can always think of one more what if that might come about that we need to prepare for. And so instead of simply living with reasonable precautions and preventative measures, we become obsessive and we catastrophize every potential situation of what will happen next. Worry dominates us. That's the worry that Jesus is talking about in our passage today. He says, don't worry about your life. And then he lists food and clothing and drink. Now, those are kind of essential things I would think are worth worrying about. But consider the time that Jesus is living in. The crops that would be harvested are dependent on rain and sun to help the crops grow and the rivers flow. Few things could be done to prevent a ship sinking at sea that came upon a storm or was attacked by marauders. And could worrying about the harvest or worrying about those merchant ships do anything to change the outcome? How much can you really prepare for a drought or a disaster such as that? Ben Witherington is helpful in his reflection on these verses. Jesus is not calling for his disciples to be irresponsible or reckless. He does not rule out forethought or planning, but he does insist that faith, not fear and anxiety, be the motivating force in what we decide and do and how we react. And he does insist on leaving the results in God's hands. So let me be clear. If a person finds themselves living in an anxious state, go talk to your doctor. Find a trustworthy counselor. Use a prescription. But our Christian faith can also be a guide through this anxiety as well. So, as a Christian, we have our faith, so that instead of just relying on our own preparation, our own ingenuity to get rid of those catastrophizing thoughts through our own breathing exercises or our gratitude journaling alone. We can direct our anxiety away from ourselves. We can look to the promise of God. We can cling to this promise that we have the presence, the mercy of God before us, and that God has declared that we belong in both life and even in death. It's faith, radical trust in the promise of God that gives us the ability to direct our attention away from all the what-ifs and instead focus our attention on the moment, on the minute, on the miraculous. Now, Jesus draws our attention in this passage today to the birds and to the lilies. And it's almost like it's an object lesson. It's a fine way to read the passage. But perhaps he's directing our attention to the flowers of the field and to the cardinals and the sparrows, the doves and the hawks. Because when we are wrapped up in all of our anxiety, we can't appreciate these simple beauties. And a way to be freed from that anxiety would be to pay attention more to these moments, these gifts, these treasures, so that our minds have less time to focus on all the things that could go wrong. Y'all know the author Kate DiCamillo? She's a children's writer. She's written some of the best novels of the past several decades. Because of Winn-Dixie, The Tale of Despero. She was interviewed last year on the radio about her writing. And in her responses, she began to reflect on the importance of wonder in her work. This is what she says. I had a friend in elementary school, Kathy Lord, and I just loved her. She would sit at the back of the classroom and she would ask to sharpen her pencil like every 3 minutes, because what she wanted to do was look at what everybody else was doing. It was just, she was so interested. And I think about her when I sit down to write. It's like, I think, be like Kathy Lord on the way to the pencil sharpener. I mean, everything and everybody that they were doing was fascinating to her. And that's a way to be in the world. You let your guard down that way if you're just curious and filled with wonder. Be fascinated, interested. Consider the lilies. Look at the birds of the air. But not a generic wonder. I wonder that if generic wonder might collapse under the weight of the anxiety, the fear, and the cynicism that surrounds us. But for the Christian, this sense of wonder turns into an act of praise. An act of praise for the one who has called you by name, the one who has promised to walk through fire and flood with you, the one who does not abandon or destroy, but who redeems and saves, the God who keeps showing up again and again in ways both big and small. Jesus concludes this section in Matthew today by redirecting our focus from our worry to instead beginning to focus on God's righteous reign in the world. If you're focused on God's righteous reign, you don't have time for all those what-ifs of life. Now, pursuing God's righteous reign is also a monumental task. We'll talk about that more in future weeks. But for today, just for today, I want to leave you with this. I don't do this a lot, give you a quip or a piece of advice at the end of a sermon. I generally think you're smarter than needing one line, but alas, here we are today. At the end of this passage, Jesus says to his disciples, "So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring worries of its own. Today's trouble is enough for today." So when you hear these horrible stories on the news, when you begin to fear that there is something terrible about to come around every corner, when the pressures of all you're trying to get done and all the burdens that are laid upon you make you want to just curl up in the bed, pull the covers over your head, turn into a ball, and cut off the lights, here's my encouragement. Take a deep breath. Maybe take 3 deep breaths. And then quote your Savior. "Let the evil of the day be sufficient thereunto." It's the King James Version. It sounds better off the tongue and it's easier to remember. "Let the evil of the day be sufficient thereunto." Make it a refrain. "Let the evil of the day be sufficient thereunto." And then listen for a bird. Look for a flower. Think about Kathy Lord on her way to the pencil sharpener. And find yourself lost in wonder, love, and praise for a God who has already gone to hell for you, so you don't have to wonder whether you have been abandoned. May faith prevail. Amen.